Every empire swears that its money is unshakable. Every government insists that the promises it makes will remain valid forever. Yet history shows time and again that this belief is false. From Rome to France, from the Confederacy to modern-day Lebanon, people have awakened to the same realization. Their savings had evaporated, their earnings had lost their meaning, and their futures had been quietly taken from them by systems they once believed were secure. Collapse is not an exception. It is the rule. The real question is not whether financial systems will fail, but how one protects oneself when they do. The illusion of permanence is the most dangerous financial mistake one can make. We look at our bank accounts and national currencies and assume they are solid, reliable foundations. But money is not firm ground. It is built entirely on trust, and that trust can disappear overnight. This is precisely why history is so harsh, yet so instructive. Every collapse leaves behind lessons, recurring patterns, and warnings about what truly preserves wealth and what can vanish with ease. When examined closely, it becomes clear that those who survive these collapses are not the most devoted believers. They are the ones who began to question first. The Byzantine Empire, often regarded as the eastern continuation of Rome and able to survive for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, stands as a powerful example. At the center of its economy stood the gold solidus, an exceptionally reliable currency accepted without hesitation by merchants from Europe to the Middle East and across Asia. For centuries it came closer than anything else in the medieval world to what we would now call a global reserve currency. The irony is that the Roman emperors should have learned from the earlier catastrophe when the silver denarius was debased until it was little more than tin coated with silver. This story had already been lived once. Yet centuries later, the Byzantines repeated the same mistake, this time with gold. They began to tamper with the purity of the metal, reducing its content and mixing in cheaper alloys. At first the change went unnoticed. Then trust started to erode. The coin that formed the backbone of Mediterranean trade gradually became nothing more than a political fiction. As value eroded, confidence vanished with it, and the Byzantine economy lost the balance it had once maintained. What remained? Neither promises on paper nor decrees of the state. In contrast, merchants who quietly accumulated real gold or land beyond the empire's borders managed to preserve their wealth while everyone else watched their money disappear. Here lies the first timeless lesson. Governments cannot resist the temptation to debase their currencies, and when they do, real value shifts toward the assets they cannot replicate. Yet not every collapse is the result of rulers manipulating monetary policy. At times, breakdowns are triggered by sudden and unexpected shocks. In the mid-14th century, Europe was shaken by one of the most devastating pandemics in its history, the Black Death. Here is the first timeless lesson. Governments cannot resist the temptation to dilute their money, and when they do, real value shifts toward assets they cannot replicate. Yet not every collapse is caused by leaders manipulating currency. Sometimes breakdowns emerge from sudden, unexpected shocks. In the mid-14th century, Europe was shaken by the most devastating pandemic in its history, the Black Death. Between 1347 and 1351, roughly half of Europe's population died. Cities emptied, villages vanished, and trade routes collapsed. Yet the economic story of the plague is more complex than a simple catastrophe. When half the labor force disappears, labor becomes valuable. Survivors could demand higher wages. Food and land, once scarce, became relatively abundant compared to people. Families with liquidity, silver, goods, or even simply the ability to work, suddenly gained leverage they could scarcely have imagined. Land that once cost a fortune could be purchased cheaply. Homes stood abandoned, fields lay unworked, and survivors found themselves in a buyer's market. If this feels uncomfortably familiar, it should. We witnessed a modern version of this during the COVID pandemic. Supply chains broke down. Governments printed trillions of dollars to keep the machinery from seizing up. And a wave of inequality followed as those with liquidity bought assets, while those living paycheck to paycheck fell behind. In the United States, housing prices soared. Stock markets rebounded almost instantly. And millions of ordinary people struggled to pay rent. The rhyme is clear: pandemics redistribute wealth. They always have. Survivors of the Black Death use scarcity to climb the social ladder. Those who emerged from COVID with liquidity bought properties, stocks, and businesses that others could no longer afford to hold. The lesson is uncomfortable, but true. Crises reward those with reserves and punish those without. And while pandemics show how quickly shocks can overturn an economy, the collapse of banking in Renaissance Florence reveals something just as vital. Institutions that appear too big to fail can fall like dominoes. In the 1340s, Florence was Europe's financial capital, home to powerful banking families such as the Bardi and the Peruzzi. These dynasties had lent enormous sums to kings, most disastrously to England's King Edward III, who was unable to repay his debts during his wars with France. When Edward suspended payments, the banks collapsed. Depositors were ruined. Trade froze. Florence, once wealthy and powerful, was thrown into chaos. Ordinary citizens who trusted the city's dominant banking dynasties discovered that size does not equal safety, and reputation does not guarantee protection. What did people learn? Too big to fail is a lie as old as finance itself. Institutions exist to generate profit, not to guarantee your survival. When they fail, they take your savings with them. This lesson repeats itself every century, from the Florentine bankruptcies to Lehman Brothers in 2008, to the freezing of bank accounts in Lebanon in 2019. Survival belongs to those who understand that an institution's promises are only valid until the day they are no longer honored. The American Civil War is remembered for its battles, politics, and the abolition of slavery. Behind the gunpowder and speeches, however, lay a brutal financial war that most Americans today barely understand. Both the Union and the Confederacy quickly discovered that a war of this scale required massive money printing. In the North, the government issued greenbacks, backed not by gold, but by the promises of the United States itself. At first, this experiment appeared bold and patriotic. But the more greenbacks flooded into the economy, the less each one could buy. Inflation eroded their value and confidence collapsed. In the South, matters were even worse. Starved of resources, the Confederacy printed astonishing quantities of graybacks. By the end of the war, Confederate inflation had reached almost unimaginable levels. Prices had risen by thousands of %, and wages could buy almost nothing. Soldiers' pay became worthless before it could even be spent. Families carried bags full of banknotes just to purchase a single loaf of bread. By 1865, Confederate currency was not merely weak, it was dead. What mattered in that collapse was not promises on paper, but tangible assets. Land, food, and gold, everything real, rose in value, while money itself became a cruel joke. For ordinary Southerners, the devastation was total. Lifetime savings turned to dust. For opportunists with access to hard assets, however, the war became a chance to acquire property and wealth at fire sale prices. A lesson Americans rarely hear but should never forget. This country has already experienced a currency collapse, and when it did, protection came not from trusting the paper in your wallet, but from holding value the system could not debase. France offers another unforgiving example of how revolutions can destroy money faster than any war. In the 1790s, when revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy and seized church lands, they introduced a new paper currency, the assignats. In theory, these notes backed by confiscated property were meant to stabilize the economy. Instead, the government printed them recklessly. Each new issuance weakened the last. Prices surged, wages lagged behind, and before long the assignats became worthless. Farmers refused to sell food for paper, demanding goods or silver instead. Bread riots returned to Paris, and the revolution began to consume itself. The winners of this collapse were not those holding patriotic paper. They were the ones who owned food, gold, or land, things the government could not print. For the ordinary Parisian, the lesson arrived too late. No matter how noble the promise, it is only worth what others are willing to accept. When trust breaks, savings do not merely shrink, they vanish. 2 centuries later, the lesson resurfaced in Asia. In 1997, what began as a speculative attack on the Thai baht spiraled into a regional financial crisis. Thailand had borrowed heavily in dollars, trusting that its currency peg would hold. When the system broke, foreign currency debts became impossible to repay overnight. Investors fled. Currencies across Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, South Korea, collapsed in a chain reaction. Economies contracted, unemployment surged, and governments turned to the International Monetary Fund, IMF, for assistance. Those who suffered most were not the global hedge funds that triggered the panic. Ordinary people were the ones whose savings were wiped out, whose mortgage costs doubled, and whose jobs disappeared. Still, the pattern was painfully familiar. Those who held dollars or assets abroad survived far better than those who trusted local currencies. While debt-dependent nations were forced into austerity, Wall Street institutions escaped through fire sale deals on Asian assets. What appeared to be a local collapse was, in reality, a global transfer of wealth. From Byzantium to Argentina, the lesson of every collapse is the same: borrowing in someone else's money is a deadly trap. When the storm hits, it is not the creditor who drowns, it is the debtor. By now, the picture should be clear. Whether revolutionary France, Civil War America, or modern Asia, the same themes repeat. Paper money collapses, debt chains nations and families, and the survivors are not those who trusted the system the most, but those who recognized its fragility before it broke. The most unsettling part of history is that collapse is not confined to distant or ancient times. It is happening now. In Lebanon, between 2019 and 2021, banks did something still unimaginable to most people in the developed world. They locked their doors. Citizens woke up to frozen deposits, withdrawal limits, and a collapsed currency. The Lebanese pound lost more than 90% of its value. A lifetime of savings was turned into pocket change. People lined up outside banks, begging to access their own money, only to be told it was gone. And this was not limited to small savers. Middle-class families, retirees, doctors, and engineers, everyone who trusted the system, was crushed. The lesson was brutal and unmistakable. The money in your bank is not a vault. It is a loan you have made to an institution that may choose not to repay you in a crisis. Those who fared best were the ones who diversified abroad, owned real assets like gold or property, or managed to keep their savings outside the banking system. Everyone else was trapped. If this feels like a remote possibility, it should not. In 2008, Americans watched banks that caused the crisis get rescued while their homes were foreclosed and their retirement funds erased. In 2020, during the pandemic, trillions were printed to keep the machine alive, a lifeline that inflated asset prices while leaving ordinary wages stagnant. In 2023, when depositors lost confidence, regional banks in the United States collapsed almost overnight, reminding everyone that too big to fail is a fairy tale we tell ourselves until the doors close. So how do you protect yourself when everything unravels? History shows there's no single answer. In Byzantium, it was gold. After the Black Death, it was liquidity to buy abandoned land. In Florence, it was refusing to trust banks deemed too big to fail. In the Confederacy, it was hard goods. In France, it was food and property. In Asia, it was avoiding debt in foreign currencies. In Lebanon, it was getting out of the banks before they locked the doors. The patterns change, but the theme remains constant. Survival comes not from blind faith in paper or institutions, but from understanding what holds real value when illusions collapse. Here is the English translation, preserving tone and meaning. Here is the paradox meant to wake you up. Collapse is both a tragedy and an opportunity. For the unprepared, it is destruction. But for those who are resilient, liquid, or holding assets that cannot be printed, it is a moment to acquire wealth at a fraction of its former cost. After the Black Death, peasants became landowners because there was too much land and not enough people to work it. After 2008, as millions of homes were foreclosed, those with cash bought houses. History shows that protection is not only about defense, it is also about positioning yourself to take what others are forced to give up under pressure. And wealth is not only about what you own, it is also about what you can do. The survivors of history were not just those who held gold or property. They were those who could create value when others could not. The baker who could still produce bread, the craftsman who could repair tools, the farmer who could feed a community, the trader who could move goods across borders. These were the people who not only survived collapses, but rose through them. In every crisis, money loses meaning, but production never does. People still need to eat, build, trade, and live. And those who can meet those needs never remain poor for long. Here is the deeper form of protection. Not blind faith in institutions, not the hope that governments or banks will save you, but the combination of real assets, real skills, and the awareness that illusions always collapse. Every crisis is a transfer, from the trusting majority to the prepared minority, from paper promises to tangible value, from passive savers to active builders. History has proven this pattern again and again. So the question is not whether everything will fall apart. It always does. The real question is whether you will be among the many who hold promises, or among the few who hold something real. History does not repeat itself, but if you ignore it, it will still crush you. If this gave you a new perspective, subscribe. History holds the answers, and I will show you where to look.